So the news these days is talking a lot about the separation of families at the border when migrants are coming from Central or South America or Mexico. And it's been really kind of ghastly with separating even very young children from their parents, such that it is difficult afterwards, even for if the parents are deported, for them to even find out where their kids are, because there's three different departments under the Homeland Security that involve with the parents, and then you have the Department of Health and Human Resources um, involved with the children, and the children are sent to, the parents are sent to detention centers and deported immediately. The children are sent to um, some kind of center where they were saying there are cages with, you know, many children packed in, some of them quite young, and then the children are supposed to be sent to shelters within a few days. In any case, you know, there's in the last 6 weeks, there's been about 2,000 children who have been separated from their parents at the border. And this is under the direction of the Department of Justice and Jeff Sessions. And while Trump says he can't stand that fact and is blaming the Democrats, actually, it's his administration that is supporting this going on. And so there's been a huge outcry against it, um, more from the Democrats than from the Republicans. But some of the religious right people, including what's his, Graham, Franklin Graham, and the Southern Baptist Convention, and some other people who are usually Trump supporters, are saying that this is immoral. Yeah. So it's really horrifying to think that this country that supposedly um, prides itself on being ethical is doing such a horrible thing, and that a political party that prides itself on being the party that supports families is sponsoring all of this. And when I think just on a humanitarian side, forgetting all the politics, if I think of what I was like as a child, you know, go back to that time when you were really, really little, you know, and how your mom and dad were everything in the world, or your grandma, or whoever it was who took care of you. They were everything, and they were your security. They were the one thing that you trusted. And, you know, as you grew older, you learned, you know, more skills, but still, your parents were the ones that you always looked to. And when I think of young children um, like that, being separated from their parents like this, you know, sometimes there's no chance to even say goodbye. And one mother even claimed she was nursing her child when ICE took the child away from her. So, you know, when I think when I was a child, like how would that have affected me to be taken away from my parents in a strange place where I don't know anybody, where I probably don't even speak the language? You know, what would have happened to me as a child? You know, your whole world falls apart. And that's the kind of trauma that these kids are enduring. And especially since there's no plan for how to unite the families again, who knows how long it will take until some of these children can see their parents. And it's not only devastating for the parents, it's devastating for the children. It's not only devastating for the kids, it's devastating for the parents too, to be separated from their children because they, cherish their children like this. So it's an extremely difficult situation, to handle emotionally when, like, we say, what can we do, to prevent this? And, we're left with calling the Department of Justice, and emailing the White House. And that's kind of it, and just speaking out, I think, in general, and speaking out with our friends and getting them to write or call the White House or the Department of Justice. There's 2 immigration bills coming up for a vote in the House. One is sponsored by some of the very far right Republicans, and most people think that will fail. There's a compromise bill that was written by the Republicans. No Democrats were included in that. And part of the terms would be that parents and children would no longer be separated if this bill were passed. But people are saying that that's using the children as a, what do you call it? A bargaining chip, thank you. A bargaining chip in order to pass a bill that would sponsor, Trump's wall, which would cost billions of dollars and would be included in the bill. And so using these children as, the bargaining trips is, it's just horrible. And I just feel very strongly, and I think you do too, that we have to return to the basic values that this country was founded upon, even if, as we're finding out now, some of the founding parents didn't live so well according to those values. Still, the values themselves are quite beautiful and ennobling. And I think as a country, we need to come back to those and, and in our society, come back to ethical conduct and proper civic discourse that treats people fairly, and especially when it comes to children, to not have policies that harm children or harm anybody. It really doesn't matter how old you are. Yeah. So this morning, Venerable Semke, at our stand-up meeting, read from Lama Yeshe's book about the taking and giving meditation. And so that is one thing we can do. Yeah. It helps us stay involved on some kind of level, and hopefully through other kinds of cause and effect sequences that we may not be cognitively aware of. It may have some effect on what happens, but I think that's a practice we can all do after we get off the telephone. Calling Jeff Sessions. Yeah. So it's really quite painful when you think that this, up until this administration, this has been a country of immigrants. They took that phrase out of the immigration, some kind of code or statement about America under the Trump administration, so that it's no longer called a country of immigrants. But in fact, it is. In fact, it is, except for the Native Americans. Everybody else here is a descendant of immigrants. Yeah? So having an immigration policy that separates families, or that totally, offers no asylum to women who have been battered, that's just plain old inhumanity that has nothing to do with politics, but everything to do with who we are as a country and who we are as human beings and how we treat each other. Okay, so let's, come back to that kind heart and our ethical conduct in our own behavior.
If I remember correctly, there's a chance these children could never be reunited with their parents. They're going to go to an adoption court and they're going to say, oh, is it in their best interest to be returned to their parents? And, well, if they can't even find the parents and the parents, probably are poor and had to come here illegally, or, they're probably going to say, well, the kid needs to be placed in a foster family so that they might be permanently split up from this point on. And then it reminds me of how the U.S. government forced Native American children to go to these boarding schools. Yes. And they split up the families in that way.
Yes.
Do you know if the Mexican government has said something about this?
If it has, I haven't read it in the paper. I haven't read anything like that. I think many of the migrants are coming from Central America. They come through Mexico.
But there might be a lot of Mexican people also.
Yes, there might be Mexicans as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment about the values, Venerable, that you talked about, the values of this country, which, as an immigrant, I actually came to admire. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of how we also view our precepts, in that our precepts are beautiful guidelines to live by. We may not always live by our precepts 100% of the time, but the fact that we are aspiring and striving to do so in and of itself is a worthy goal and a worthy way of living. And so even though the values of this country are so high that it itself may not be able to live by them 100% of the time, that doesn't mean they should be tossed aside and trampled on. Yeah. On the contrary, they should continue to be a standard for how countries treat their own people as well as their neighbors and everyone else in the world. And so it's a shame and sad that they're not being observed or respected the way they used to.
And one of the UN agencies, I can't remember which one, also criticized this thing of separating families at the border. Yeah, one of the UN Relief Agency or something, I can't remember. Yeah. It's Jeff Sessions, well, Trump had said before too, zero tolerance for illegal immigration. And so charging everybody who enters illegally with criminal charges, so making every person who enters illegally a criminal. They can't do that for juveniles. So that's how they say, well, we're taking the kids away from the parents. But then they charge the parents with criminal activity and deport them.
Then are they sentencing the parents before they deport them?
I don't know exactly. I mean, usually sentencing takes a while, but so I don't know exactly how that's working. But they are definitely charging them with criminal activity.
And so they're taking their kids away, saying you're arrested, and so you don't have custody of your kids.
Something like
Instead
that.
of deporting the kids with them.
Right. Because you can't charge the kids with, a criminal being a criminal. So they justify that. And it's very complicated because the person in charge of the Trump says that this is a democratic policy. Actually, there's no policy. Nobody passed a policy stating this. This was Jeff Sessions' decision, bolstered, of course, by Trump's immigration philosophy. And the Department of Homeland Security says that they don't advocate doing this. But then, of course, over the weekend, several people from the House of Representatives went to Texas and one other state, I forget, where to look at some of the facilities where the kids were. Yeah. And yeah, ICE is doing this. Okay, last comment and then we'll stop.
If the parents are found to be criminals, then they can't ever immigrate to the United States.
Probably, yeah.
So then that's another, permanent separation.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah. It's unbelievable. But the trauma the parents are experiencing, this is going to produce lifelong effects on the children, especially the very young ones, and, as if they didn't have enough problems fleeing from the country, where they were growing up because it was dangerous there, then they have to come here, which is, known as the land of freedom, and be treated in this horrible, disrespectful way.